Good morning, everyone. How are you doing today? That's good. Good to hear it. How many of you have seen Did My Grandfather Kill My Grandfather already? So a lot of people have. So as many of you know, this is part of our Talk Theater series. This is where we invite scholars and other people to join us and have conversations about themes and ideas that are related to the play. And as we discuss this today, there may be some references within the play. When we get to the point that we ask questions of our guests, I really encourage you to think about the fact that some of the other people have not seen this play. Right? But we will try and sort of answer as many questions as we can. As you know, this play is our first West Virginia writer that we've produced, but it is an interesting journey for this writer and this actor performer. And so we thought it was really exciting to be able to give some context outside of his personal experience. So we're delighted to welcome Dr. Allison Varzally, who is here talking also about the book that she has published, which is entitled
Children of Reunion, Adopted Vietnamese, and Malaysians in the Politics of Family Migrations.
Yeah. And I encourage you to order that from the local bookstore, Four Seasons Bookstore, if you're interested in reading this after we finish our session today. So Dr. Allison Varzally, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, and I know some of you know this, we are also Zooming this. And so if we can just keep noise to a minimum so it doesn't distract the owl. But of course, when you answer questions, it will certainly welcome your volume and commitment to the question. Right, thank you.
Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I haven't been to this part of West Virginia before, but it's a really beautiful setting to look at new contemporary voices. And I too had the pleasure of watching Cody's play last night after reading it, and it was just so powerful to see it on stage. And I think my work really complements his perspective, and I'm really looking forward to your questions. So I have kind of maybe remarks of maybe 30 minutes, and then I hope we can just kind of open it up to kind of questions and insights. So I'm a historian. I work at California State University, Fullerton, which is right near Anaheim. And I'm interested in questions about the history of immigration, multiracial relations, community making, and U.S. citizenship. And some of the questions that Cody LeRoy Wilson in his play, who is an American, who is Asian American, how do those definitions change over time, what are the legacies and meanings of the American war in Vietnam, how do we discover and tell stories about the past, including our family's past, when the evidence is missing or limited, and can we work, and this is kind of the mission of historians, to share a fuller, more exhausting picture of the past, one that, using Cody's words from his play, that kind of lifts the veil that sometimes covers the truth.
Excuse me, Allison, I'm sorry, those on Zoom are asking you to speak up. Just
Oh,
a little bit.
sure,
Thank you
sure,
so
yeah.
much.
Absolutely. Hi for folks in the audience too. So yeah, just raise your hand. Would you mind bringing the slides up first?
Absolutely.
And then be on the title slide, just to have the first slide of the photographs would be great. Thank you. So my book, Children of Reunion, Adopted Vietnamese, and Malaysians in the Politics of Family Migrations, is about the history of Vietnamese children that were adopted by Americans between 1965 and about 1990. Children like Cody's mom, Latoria Lee, who was born Lei K. Lin and grew up in West Virginia, but also children like Trista Goldberg, born in UNT2. Next slide, please. So you can see some, more. Good. So you can see Trista, UNT2 right here, pictured, and she is in Vietnam. That is her foster sister. And she is adopted my American family, the Goldbergs. There she is with her siblings, I think at Disneyland or Disney World. And she grew up in the mostly white community of Easterville, Pennsylvania. In both of these cases, right, of Latoria's and Trista Goldberg's, it's their fathers who were serving in Vietnam and as American soldiers initiated the process of adoption and brought these Vietnamese children to the United States. In Trista's case, she was 4 years old at the time of adoption, so she did have some memories of her Vietnamese family. And she also recalled crying when she first met her American father because he had a full beard and she wasn't accustomed to facial hair. So there's some kind of cultural clashes that happen. So my research explores the lives and the representations of Vietnamese youth like Trista and like Latoria to try to better understand their American and Vietnamese families. And also bigger questions about the Vietnamese diaspora, kind of the migrations out of Vietnam, and also changing ideas about US citizenship in the latter part of the Cold War. This was a period of heightened debate and questions about the purpose of the United States in the wider world. And because of the timing of Vietnamese adoptees' arrival in the United States, and the often very chaotic conditions that generated their departure from Vietnam, Vietnamese adopted children became convenient sites. And then when they grew up, they became active participants in these discussions about what did the Vietnam War mean for both in the United States, what were and should be kind of the principles and practices of American foreign policy, and what should be its immigration policies, what was the process and the consequences of Vietnamese migrations, and more fundamentally, what was the nature of the American family. Next slide, please. So as a brief background to the American War in Vietnam, and I know you're all familiar with that war, but it's really important context, right, for Cody's play and for my work. So I thought very briefly just to revisit that war. So the US presence in Vietnam actually dated to FDR's administration and the US efforts to try to control the decolonization of French Indochina in the 1940s. And in the ensuing decade, really the failure of these attempts to prop up the French prompted his successor, Harry Truman, to slowly and steadily increase American support for the French, who were battling against an emergent, independent. Now, like other populations that had suffered the indignities of colonial rule, the Vietnamese were seeking independence and were seizing the opportunity of the weakening French Empire to launch essentially a revolution that successfully toppled the French in 1954. The Geneva Accords that settled that conflict between the French and the Vietnamese nationalists partitioned Vietnam into northern and southern sectors. But at that moment, rather than kind of step away from the region, the United States under President Eisenhower worked pretty feverishly to build an anti-communist South Vietnamese state under the leadership of Diem. Cold War competition with the Soviet Union and China definitely motivated the US in the area, but it was also about the post-war reconstruction of Japan and Great Britain, a desire for markets and materials in Southeast Asia, the entreaties of both the British and the French to try to hold on, maintain influence in the area, and even the appeals of Vietnamese elite who were worried about communist gains. So by 1965, the US had committed the first ground troops, and by 1968, following the coordinated attacks of the North Vietnamese Army and the National Liberation Front on more than 100 cities in South Vietnam, known as the Tet Offensive, the US actually escalated its involvement in the area and began to adopt what would become sort of controversial methods of warfare, counterinsurgency, and Vietnamization, where they tried to kind of shift some of the responsibility onto Vietnamese troops. American popular opinion about the war that had been robust, right, in the very beginnings, is turning sour around by 1968 in the Tet Offensive. And then Richard Nixon, although he promises to get the United States out of Vietnam, didn't initially do so. Instead, he intensifies a bombing campaign, especially on the border between Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, and reassures South Vietnamese leader that the U.S. is there to stay until they win. Ultimately, though, when the U.S. and Vietnamese allies are going to withdraw in 1975, it is hastily, and something that Cody talked about in his play. The North Vietnamese kind of pushed into the South, kind of upsetting the established regime, and the United States blasting the sounds of kind of Christmas music signals to Americans that the war is ended. And it tries to get Vietnamese allies out of Vietnam in a very kind of hasty and desperate way. Ultimately, looking back, the estimate is that as many as 3 million Vietnamese, that's civilians and soldiers, were killed during the conflict, and approximately about 60,000 American soldiers perished. And that doesn't count for all the kind of casualties and longer-term kind of environmental and psychological impacts. Next slide. So that is the backdrop of this war against which this story of Vietnamese adoptions by Americans happened. So between 1963 and 1976, Americans adopted an estimated, I'll try to be precise here, 3,267 children from Vietnam. And American adoptions of Vietnamese children were continuing a larger pattern of Americans assuming care for foreign children displaced by political and economic instability that really dated to the 1930s. I'm talking about it in a more systematic way. U.S. voluntary agencies had initiated child sponsorship programs in troubled regions where poor children received money and school supplies, clothes, and gifts from American foster parents. During the 1940s, the U.S. military presence in Europe and then a resultant refugee crisis prompted the expansion of these child sponsorship programs, again, where America gift and money and supplies to children. It also, though, in the 1940s, initiates really the first formal legal provisions for inter-country adoption. And that really sets up a kind of foundation for later in the 20th century. In total, more than 4,000 European children were adopted by Americans between 1948 and 1953, so just after World War II. And their absorption into American families in part expressed the power of anti-communist belief. Because most of those children that are adopted by Americans in that period, those who are receiving visas for intercountry adoption, originated from countries that had been unsettled by communists. But there's also this larger shift in ideas about how to care for foreign children and how to take responsibility for American foreign policy. So increasingly, rather than simply send money and goods and supplies to foreign children, to invest in families and communities and infrastructure over there, Americans after World War II would increasingly try to bring children to the United States and make them formally part of American families. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Part of it was that the U.S. was increasingly involved in the wider world, but also because of changes within the American borders. Falling domestic fertility rates that in part had to do with rising opportunities for women in the workforce meant there was essentially more of a demand for children to adopt. And at the same time, as the World War II kind of faded and the European countries of the continent rebuilt and restored and began to care for their own children, there was essentially fewer European babies that were available for inter-country adoption. Part of that change also was that there was less of a stigma for women who were caring for their children outside the context of marriage. There was also less stigma for kind of multiracial children, the offspring of Black GIs and European women. Instead, those children would be cared for in Europe. So this tension between kind of a heightened American kind of appetite for, demand, or hope for adopted children and a dwindling supply in Europe meant that Americans hoping to parent are looking elsewhere. And humanitarian principles still mattered as well. This is why Americans began to look more and more to Asia, to Japan, to a lesser extent, but especially China, Japan, and then Vietnam, which is really the site of my study. But even looking, and we talked a little bit about this before the talk, comparing where adoptions are happening in Asia, one of the fundamental differences, I think, that was the Vietnamese case compared to Korea or China, is that the US was in a very different stage of its foreign policy. So in Vietnam, when Americans were adopting, it was less as a fulfillment of the containment policy and anti-communist ideals, and increasingly more an expression of regret and disappointment, and an attempt to make amends for what they saw as the US wrongs in the region. So American soldiers, like one of Corey's grandfathers, were often central to the process of adoption in Vietnam. Now, some of these American soldiers had fathered Vietnamese children or fathered children with Vietnamese women and sought to adopt those children. And as multiracial individuals, and often as, I guess, reminders of kind of American presence, these children were often struggling with hardship, discrimination, marginalization in American society, in Vietnamese society, which created kind of incentives for their fathers to take responsibility. There were others, like Angela Menon's father, who is pictured here, and this photo is from 1990, who enthusiastically embraced their Vietnamese children decades later, when their now grown-up Vietnamese children used a mix of DNA evidence and physical records to locate their fathers. Of course, there were other American soldiers' fathers who were unaware of their children or didn't actively try to take responsibility for them. And then there was another group of American soldiers who didn't father Vietnamese children, but had significant contact with them in the setting of local orphanages, which are abundant, or as so-called helpers who were performing, small tasks and errands for American GIs for a little bit of pay. Now, after the My Lai massacre, and pretty graphic American press coverage of U.S. atrocities, the atrocities of American troops, and broader losses in the region made the war increasingly unpopular, the U.S. military actually used stories and images and accounts of American soldiers positively interacting with Vietnamese children as a way of trying to soften these men's images in war to make them more relatable, and also to try to restore American support for the war, right? To try to really change the narrative. There were cases, again, like in Corey's grandfather, where these men fell into a kind of parental or paternal love with these children and wanted to adopt them. And in these cases, the U.S. military largely disapproved and tried to throw up obstacles in the path of formal adoption. And I think one of the things I wish Cody was really interesting to discover how his father was able to bring his mother, Latoya, to the U.S., given often the resistance of the U.S. military. The U.S. military reasoned that these men were young, a lot of them were single or without wives, and that this was just complicating the men's service and their exit from Vietnam. The International Social Service, which was a global group that assisted families and individuals in matters of child custody and immigration, desertion, and especially in the Vietnam era with international adoption, they also found these attempts by American soldiers to try to adopt Vietnamese children problematic. Partially this was because, and I'll talk more about this later, and this was a problem for anyone trying to adopt Vietnamese children, is that a number of the children in orphanages were not actually orphans, that they had kind of living relations. There was so much fluidity in the war. It wasn't always clear what the relations were and how the orphanages were being used. Also, the ISS raised concerns because it had documented cases where these adoptions initiated by American soldiers braved their marriages with American women who hadn't encountered these Vietnamese children until they showed up on their doorstep, and hadn't had the same experience or context of the war. Slide, please. Ken Armstrong, who's pictured here and this is in 2015, he was an Army medic, and he was among the American soldiers who jumped across or through the bureaucratic and principal hurdles and was able to adopt a Southeast Asian boy named Ree. You can see him here. He had entered the hospital after the death of his parents and siblings in 1967. And Armstrong actually convinced his parents to adopt Ree on his behalf. And that was one way of circumventing kind of the U.S. Army's kind of objections or obstacles. And also that of the orphanages who were generally opposed to placing children with single individuals. And Armstrong was able to convince his parents in part by writing a letter explaining that this boy, who he had again kind of fallen in a kind of paternal love with, really needed him. But he also confessed to his parents, and these are Ken's words, "This is a lonely place, and I've become attached to him. I didn't want to give him up." End of quote. Now, the military and political situation in South Vietnam deteriorated in 1975. The number of adoptions increased, and adoption as a practice remained really central to American debates about wars in the region and what its commitments were to Vietnamese people. The U.S. government, in collaboration with social welfare and adoption agencies, arranged for military and commercial planes to transport Vietnamese orphans to the United States. Next slide. In theory, these airlifts were just, and they were nicknamed Operation Baby Lift, were simply facilitating adoption proceedings that were already in motion. Right? The children selected for the airlift had already been paired with appropriate American families who were eager to receive them. But in the rushed execution of the plan, right, in 1975, it was chaos, right, in South Vietnam. The program resulted in confusion and tragedy. One of the first official flights of Operation Baby Lift, carrying an estimated 300 children and adult caregivers, exploded in midair. The craft's skilled pilot managed to land eventually and heroically, but only half of the passengers on that flight survived. Rather, though, than derail the evacuation amidst this tragedy, the really horrific accident only strengthened the resolve of the organizers to get Vietnamese children out of Vietnam. While expressing sorrow for the victims of the crash, in fact, President Ford insisted, his words, "Our mission of mercy must continue. This tragedy must not deter us, but offer new hope for the living." End of quote. Here you see President Ford in kind of the center of the picture. He's intercepting one of the airplanes of the bigger Baby Lift that successfully reached the United States, and most did. And he's holding a Vietnamese child in his arms. This was a poetic and really powerful expression of the U.S. taking responsibility. In prioritizing the plight of Vietnamese children after years of relative inattention to kind of the sufferings of Vietnamese during the war, the U.S. government was adopting kind of a rhetoric of responsibility that had long been expressed by left-leaning Americans who were critical of the war and had been talking about the fate of Vietnamese children since the mid-1960s. admitting the nation's kind of culpability in the destruction and the dissolution of American families, officials now were trying not for American sins maybe in the region and relieve the suffering of Vietnamese children, but also trying to control the story about the peace. The war had gone poorly, they acknowledged, but they could still salvage the nation's reputation by arranging an honorable departure from Vietnam, saving over 2,000 orphans from the clutches of communism would be a perfect exiting maneuver. But Vietnamese would disrupt these efforts and dispute the message the US government and others were offering by reappearing as refugees in the United States and trying to reunion with family members, including a lot of these children who have been adopted into American families. In his play, Cody LeRoy Wilson wonders and dreams, quote, "What happened to my mom's parents? What happened to my mom's parents?" And eventually he seems to make peace with the reality that he may never know. But sometimes in my research, what I discovered is that Vietnamese relations searched for and did find their adopted kin, like Cody's mother. Sometimes what happened did become clear. Vietnamese mothers, fathers, uncles, aunts, cousins, and grandparents, in part, strategically used the airlift and orphanages as a means of assuring the safety of their young relatives, with whom they intended to reconnect if and when, often and if, they migrated to the United States. So rather than always orphans abandoned or relinquished, a number of the children on these planes had family members who were hoping to return them. Vietnamese had kind of seized on the evacuation, definitely desperate, but necessary strategy in a longer process of migration and reunion. Those fortunate enough to reach the United States and initiate their plans of reconciliation, though, confronted the contrary ambitions of American families, agencies, adoption agencies, and government officials who viewed adoption and the assimilation of Vietnamese children as both an apology for the nation's wrongs in Vietnam and also an affirmation of the material and the moral value of the United States. In arguing for their parental rights and introducing Americans to the forms and obligations of the extended Vietnamese family, though, the refugees were rejecting interpretations of the war in favor of their own. Now, in the early hectic days of Operation Baby Lift, most Americans had endorsed the government evacuation efforts, cheering media accounts of first encounters between parents and Vietnamese orphans. Time magazine, just as one example, wrote that, quote, "Not since the return of the prisoner of war 2 years ago has there been a news story out of Vietnam with which the average American could so readily identify," end of quote. American and participants seeking a happy ending to the tragic war of Vietnam could now find it in these airlifts and the adoption of these children. But the initial exuberance and unqualified support by American citizens and the mass media expressed in response to Operation Baby Lift soon turned to dismay and doubt. Next slide, please. There were a flurry of editorials, news stories, and political cartoons like this one in Doonesbury that came to bitterly criticize the motives and the conduct of the Ford administration, the Tea regime, aspiring parents of Vietnamese children, adoption agencies, and volunteers. This cartoon and others were suggesting that this was politically motivated, that this was not in the interest of Vietnamese or Vietnamese children. Part of this was as if kind of the built-up disappointment and frustration of so many Americans about the war had suddenly had a chance of just kind of flying over. Within the kind of the torrent came out of these floodgates of disappointment were Vietnamese refugees who were decided that they were going to participate in a class action lawsuit instigated by the Center for Constitutional Rights, which challenged the orphan status and the adoptive placements of the heirloom children. There's fathers, uncles, aunts, cousins, right? And I'm emphasizing those multiple relations because there's a strong and extended sense of family and a lot among Vietnamese, right? So even if your mother was dead, your father was dead, other families stepped in, right, to take care. So those who are participating in this class action, so you have these different relations. They wanted to reclaim children and insisted that they again had mistakenly or temporarily placed the children in these orphanages. The lawsuit originated in San Francisco's Presidio. If you've been to that, it's now been kind of converted into a park. But that was one of the primary sites where the heirlooms of children were being processed. And at that site, there were a number of Vietnamese and Vietnamese Americans who had been hired to translate and to work with the children. And what a couple of them discovered in their conversations with the Vietnamese children who were old enough to speak is that they still had not just memories of their family, but that the children were convinced that their family members were alive. And so these women shared their discoveries with the U.S. government, who largely kind of turned a blind eye and a deaf ear, but they were able to find kind of sympathizers in part in the anti-war movement. And so this class action suit came out of that discovery. And ultimately, it charged the U.S. government, 7 adoption agencies, with bringing children to the United States who they said were not orphans and had not been properly released for adoption. Next slide, please. In the court case, the plaintiff's attorneys argued that these adoptions were politically motivated, highlighting the harm done to the Vietnamese children and criticizing the U.S. government's actions. They emphasized the strength of American families, they said, who practiced extended kinship systems, asserting that foreign adoption was alien and antithetical to Vietnamese culture. They insisted that U.S. adoption agencies and the government were just using adoptions as an opportunity. Among those Vietnamese that they represented was Son Shi, who explained that she had surrendered her daughter only temporarily to a Catholic organization in Vietnam because she feared for her and her daughter's life in the advance of communists. And many other Vietnamese women insisted again that they had never signed or intended to sign relinquishments of their children. Adoptive parents, though, and the U.S. government countered that these Vietnamese children were legitimately abandoned, that they were suffering, and the agencies had practiced proper protocols. Parents like Joan and Catherine Strand, who adopted 3 Vietnamese children, emphasized that the children were better off with them, who could offer not only warm and loving homes, but an economically stable environment. Despite changing their children's names from the Vietnamese names to Rebecca, Rachel, and Aaron, they also believed that they could honor the children's Vietnamese culture and the wish of their mother for them to, quote, live and be happy in America. Judge Spencer Williams, who was a judge presiding over the lawsuit, ordered an investigation into these adoption cases. But when the investigation produced conflicting reports and divisive testimony of such complexity, he ruled that the cases did not constitute a class action suit because they defy generalization, and that if they were to be settled, it would be individually in state courts. Many Vietnamese families were disappointed, but others took that opportunity. And among them was the case that I want to briefly talk about here. An's case, as the Vietnamese mother involved, was particularly compelling and illustrative of both the complex arguments, but also the heartbreak of these custody battles. An fought for years to reclaim her son, Vinh, after migrating to the United States in 1975 after the death of her husband. Ben's American family, the Nelsons. And here is Barney Nelson holding Ben, also known as Ben. They insisted that they had acted legally and had become really attached to this young boy. But the Iowa Supreme Court that was hearing the case ruled in favor of the Vietnamese mother, recognizing her maternal rights and commitment, even though he also acknowledged that there were essentially two good homes available here, and that someone would inevitably be hurt by the decision. Ultimately, this and other custody battles reflected these broader discussions about the painful consequences of the war, the complexities of international adoption, and the efforts of Vietnamese families to try to repair and recreate their kinship networks in the United States and across national borders. So in conclusion, the end of the Vietnam War and the formalization of Vietnamese adoptions ultimately would ease some of these debates about the legitimacy of the airlifts and global commitments made in the name of anti-communism. But these discussions raise these bigger questions again about what were America's responsibilities to regions where it intervened. What were the prospects for racial equality? What was the role of family in social change? During this era, adoption, I argue, was used not just as an extension of American ideals, but a means of addressing and making amends for the nation's perceived mistakes in Vietnam. Now, as the American War kind of became more of a historical footnote, right, and time passed, as these adopted Vietnamese children grew up, and some reunited with their biological families, others like Cody did not, Cody's mother did not. There was also Amerasians with American fathers who immigrated in the late 1980s. All of these individuals, they came to play a much more active role in these discussions, right, as they became kind of grown-ups and tried to wrestle with their own identity and history. I think as Cody does in the play, that their voices became foregrounded, again, in the questions about what's the legacy of the war, what does it mean to be kind of Vietnamese and to form a Vietnamese American community, how do we belong together? Thank you. Look forward to your question.
Great. The first question.
I actually have a two. The first thing is, yay, when we have children and then their adopted family, the cultural, racial, ethnic differences, there's more of an effort to respect the biological heritage of that child. And we can do that a little easier today. But in those time periods, when we cut off a lot of relationships with the country of Vietnam, that's really hard to do. And that creates a lot of emotional dynamics with the adoptee.
Absolutely. No, that's a really good point. I mean, part of it, when the war ended, it really didn't end, and there was a lot of early hostility. You know, the Vietnamese, I think, maybe only second to Soviet Jews, are the largest refugee population to the U.S. in the 20th century. But there was a lot of concern and worry among Americans about Vietnamese migration and that refugees. And I think part of that kind of anger or uncertainty would be directed at Vietnamese adopted as well as kind of the refugees. And you're right, I think in the 1960s and 1970s, there's starting to be more of, I guess, maybe a kind of a multicultural revolution, and people are starting to think more and about honoring cultural heritage, right? But there wasn't, I think, the level of resources or awareness. As I talked to more recent kind of adoptees, and I think for that later generation, you're right. I think the parents are very conspicuously trying to raise them with some understanding. There's even they're called like heritage tours that a lot of these adopted will take when they're in their teens or early 20s. That seems to be again, Cody talked about this, like the phases of his own awareness, right? 1 to 6, he didn't even think, he had no idea, right, that he was Asian American, right? And then So there's often a stage, I think, in these adopted lives where they start thinking about, oh my gosh, who am I? Who are my parents? What's my background? And I think that these heritage tours happen at that moment. But yeah, to your question, I think that there's fewer resources, fewer opportunities to explore the heritage. And for some of these, what I read among the American parents, there are some who are in a very deliberate way trying to introduce them to or give them access to Vietnamese culture. But there's others who are like, they should be American, right? They love hamburgers and hot dogs, right? That's the way that they should belong, that we shouldn't highlight their difference.
It's easier for European adoptees because they physically look like.
Their parents, right? And, yeah, they're not, that question again, to circle back to the play, like, where are you from, right? That can be a very loaded question. And if you are, I think, of Asian descent or have any family members, it feels like you're saying you don't belong, you're foreign, right? As opposed to I'm from Plum Run, West Virginia.
Could you talk about your other book about the restaurant business? Because a lot of people who come here, they come to a life of poverty because they may not have a skill set to be a professional in this country. And so I found it interesting how the restaurant business has helped some people come out of poverty because Americans want to explore different cuisines. And so, you know, if you're the only Vietnamese restaurant in town or whatever, then you might have some economic stability that you otherwise would not have.
Yes, absolutely. No, thank you for the promotion too. But yeah, so I'm working on a new book, and I guess the common tie is immigration. That's kind of what I'm excited to look at throughout my career as a historian. So yeah, I'm looking at immigrant in California, just because it is an immigrant-rich region and there is such a confluence of immigrants there. But I think, you know, obviously there's plenty of other settings from like rural West Virginia to New York City where it is a way into a community, it's a livelihood. Also, you know, even if a culture seems foreign, I think food is a quicker means of access, right? And that restaurant becomes like a foundation of the community, right? And the cultural exchange.
Okay. We're going to take one question on Zoom and then we'll come back to the room.
Could you tell us anything about how you got interested in this topic?
Oh, thank you. Gosh, I'm trying to think of, so my first book, was about kind of the civil rights activism of multiple kind of immigrant minority groups in California in the middle of the 20th century that helped kind of topple some of the most egregious forms of legal discrimination in education, housing, marriage. And so in that book, I had uncovered cases, I guess, of what was called like interracial families, right? Where a couple, you know, one person who identified as a Mexican American, and the other identified as Jewish American married. And that was kind of scandalous and unusual. So I was curious about kind of the sites of interracial families as a space of change, right? And how that could kind of echo through society. And then I think I found, I guess, a case of an adopted Vietnamese child. It's like, oh, there's a similar kind of dynamic, right? Interracial families, how does race relations get worked out? Does it matter that they're a girl or they're a boy? I think I was interested in the Vietnam War and in part because of my own generation story, right? A lot of these adopted are my age, right? There are my contemporaries. Philadelphia, where I'm from, also was one of the many sites where Vietnamese refugees were resettled. The general concept of the US government was to try to spread out the Vietnamese population because they were worried about discrimination and hostility. They thought, you know, if we kind of essentially dilute the refugee population by making sure they're in a lot of different places rather than just one place, their integration would be quicker. So I think maybe it's also my own kind of awareness of that refugee population in Philadelphia.
We have a question over here. Yes.
Yes, can you comment on any similar dynamic that occurred during
the Korean War and after the Korean War?
Yeah, great question, great question. So and I would point you, in the direction, it's a fantastic book by, Susie Wu, among Susie Wu, who looks at kind of Korean adoptees. So it's, in some ways, it's a precedent for Vietnamese adoptions. It's larger in number. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but there's a lot more Korean adopted, in the United States, than Vietnamese. And there, I guess it has, the difference I would say, is that South Korea remained kind of an ally of the United States. I think a lot of those who were adopting during the Korean War were still supportive of the war and supportive of the anti-communist mission in South Korea. And so in looking at their kind of justifications and explanations, it was really about humanitarianism, and it was about saving children from communism. That, I think, was the dominant justification. By the Vietnam War, just because it was a much more divisive war and there was a much stronger criticism, what I found, was partially looking at kind of records around the number of kind of peace parents actually were not buying into or accepting the anti-communist justification, right? For them, it's like, we need to help Vietnamese people and children to apologize for a war that we think is a desperate mistake, right? That we are responsible for these orphans because of the war that we are contributing to in the region. So that's, I guess, one, I think, key difference in how it is explained or justified or motivated by American parents. And I think as the adopted grow up, there was a much larger Korean adopted population that could find one another. And this, of course, was a generation before, cell phones and social media. But they are finding one another in the early 1990s when they are, late teens, early adults, through the internet. And I think so there was a stronger, earlier network of Korean adopted who were like, hey, this is a unique experience. Is anybody else like me out there? So I think they had that kind of advantage too. And then I guess the last thing is, we talked about this earlier, and this is related to why there's more Korean adopted. That practice lasted longer than it did in Vietnam. Right? There were certainly Vietnamese who were adopted after the American stage of the war, but it didn't last as long. And I think South Korea ultimately, they didn't eliminate, but they reduced the possibilities for Americans in part out of a sense of kind of national pride. Right? I think it was when South Korea hosted the Olympics, they were worried about the optics of their not being able to care for and kind of integrate their own children.
Right. I have a question here, and that was from you. Yes.
Thank you for this talk.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned briefly about a little bit of the connection of families who have the birth parents and then kind of giving the message to the children. Do you know of any letters that the bio parents have left, and what do you?
Yeah. And these are cases where the children haven't really connected with the bio parents, but they have some record or documents of, yes. Sometimes if it's not a letter, a note, right, that might even have been attached to the child. It's not uncommon, but I'm not sure how kind of, but photographs also might be kind of pressed into the child's palm. I heard, that from a number of adoptees. So there's these kind of scraps of evidence, and obviously those are incredibly dear to the individual. I think we're also living in the age of DNA evidence, and there have been a number of cases. And this is more systematized. I think there's some databases that adoptees have constructed where essentially, and this is in part trying to link adopted Vietnamese to maybe their American fathers, if they know they're multiracial, that there is some success in kind of tracking down your biological parents through kind of DNA, evidence that ancestry of stuff. And then it moves, I guess, from just the photograph or the letter to the actual reunion. And some of those, those reunions are incredibly powerful and intense. Sometimes those are disappointing too, right? There's a lot, they're so freighted at that moment. And a lot of times, these adoptees are obviously they're deeply connected to and appreciate their adoptive parents, right? That's been their meaningful parent, right? And so it's not about the rejection of that, it's about trying to find this other part of themselves. Thank you.
Following up on your brief comment on the post-war declining concern, could you tell us a little bit more about the boat people, how that cohort differed from those who escaped just before or the end of the war? And is that a different population in terms of characteristics? Were their experiences different?
That's a great question. Yes, I think that maybe I'll call it that first wave, right? That most of them were closely affiliated and working for the United States in some way, whether they were part of the military, whether they were doing other kind of support roles. They tended to be more elite, more educated. Again, because the departure was so chaotic, right? The US really didn't have a full plan, or I don't think really anticipate all the meetings that we're trying to lead. So I think the US first made kind of slow arrangements for that group that was more connected, more elite. That later generation of, boat people were just desperate to get out. Some of them did have means, and that was among their motivations for leaving, because they're worried about what would happen to their property in the kind of a communist regime. They are families, right? Which is a little bit different. A lot of times in early immigration, you have men come for labor. That's not this case. These are true kind of refugees. The US set up as part of their kind of trying to process the boat people, a set of kind of military camps, first in, I think, the Philippines and Thailand, and then those refugees would be moved into, there's a big processing camp in Pennsylvania here. California is one of the major sites, Camp Pendleton, and essentially they were converted into kind of camps, right? Well, the US government tried to figure out what do we do with all these people. So maybe another difference is just the volume of the boat people and how kind of unprepared the US was to try to kind of care for them.
Thank you for your presentation. Two questions, both sincere. First is, where to eat in LA? And I'll get your answer later. The second is, as you look ahead to the geopolitical instability of this century, what is your speculation around adoption in general?
But yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely, because it does seem where Americans adopted have often, and it comes out of not only where the US has been most active in the world, but also a humanitarian impulse. And then also, I think, their adoptions within the United States are fewer than they were even a decade ago. And I think that's for a number of reasons, but that also means that there is, I think, an interest in adopting by American families. So one possibility, right, with more instability, whether that's by climate or politics, is that Americans would have more and new places, right, to try to adopt children from. But I also think the adopted population is more vocal about their experience, and I think Americans probably have more of a sense of the complexity of that adoption, that it's not easy, right? And whether that would deter or just means when you do adopt, you really understand and have a different approach. That might also be kind of a legacy. But yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you.
Back row.
What was the reaction of the public education system? Any good communities having the children, both in education, but also their social relationships. And well, and it's kind of related to that. Cody didn't feel at home because he was in New York City.
Yeah, yeah.
And so,
That's,
once the kids grow up, adults, are there any agencies that will help them get in figuring out their identity or making it less painful to them?
yeah, that's a great question, because again, there was no single location to which these adopted children are directed, right? So that obviously their American families are all over the place, and all as often to be again in rural Virginia or as New York City, right? So they're often growing up in communities where they are the only kind of person of Asian descent, where there aren't other communities or aren't other awareness. Some of the adoptees talked about early cases where they would interact with American veterans who were just processing their own trauma around the war, and that got directed at the adoptive, right, at a random restaurant. So that seemed to be a theme, but once they kind of discover, oh wow, at first I think they didn't think of themselves as any different than their adopted family, right? That's maybe part of just their development. But as they are kind of made aware of their difference, and how unique or strange they are in their communities, that was painful, right? And so I think in terms of when they grow up, it is finding a more cosmopolitan, multiracial place. I think for a lot of them in college, right, whether it's like Asian American studies programs, and then I think the internet was huge in helping, I guess, adopted find one another and hear common stories. And I think there are a lot of networks out there, reunions now, I think, for those who participate in the heritage tours, I think that becomes a bond. So even though they're kind of dispersed, I think there is community that they've been able to create. And even though my research focuses on the United States, the US was not the only country that was adopting Vietnamese or Korean children, right? I think Australia was another common destination. Europe was not uncommon either. Obviously, the US had this particular relationship with Vietnam that shaped the process. But so some of them are, again, in terms of community, it's not just only in the US, right? It's Australia and Europe.
In terms of primary and secondary education, then we're just on their own.
Yeah, yes, that's right. And for a lot of these Vietnamese were babies, right? So that they grew up with English as their language. For those who are a little bit older, the challenge of interpretation, right, in their schools was really, really difficult. And I think the schools didn't have the resources, especially if you're the only kind of Vietnamese child in the school, you're not doing anything in particular. Question.
Have you been to Vietnam?
I haven't, and it is top on my to-do list, right? Just to kind of see that.
We did get to travel all over there, and I was just wondering how someone like you would be received.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I will have to travel and then come back to you. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's I feel like I've been there through the oral histories and the memories and the stories. But I would absolutely love to kind of be on site, and that's a good question about how how the story of adopted is received, how it would be received by a historian, right? As opposed to someone like Cody, where that is his personal experience.
One of the things that surprised me, so I was not sure what to expect as an American,
right,
and how we were received. We were taken in. Stories were told. We got to go into somebody's house and eat with a whole group of people. It was someone who was taking us around and we didn't want to drive anymore. And she said, well, then come to dinner at my house. And this feast came within this communist-like building with
with 5 or 6 people living in very small space, and who were so happy to receive us. So I'm just saying, that,
Oh, it's great.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you know, as much as this war, given its proximity to this adoption story, that it just overshadows, you know, that's a long time ago for, you know, I teach at Cal State Fullerton, and all the students were born in the 21st century, right? So this is deep history. So I imagine maybe similarly in kind of Vietnam, right, the younger generation, that their history is more recent, and certainly I think that the economy and tourism has changed, right, as Vietnam has reopened, I think.
It's an incredible place.
I'm gonna take 2 more questions. We'll take this one and then here.
Okay, I would imagine that the children who came over spoke Vietnamese and no English. As they were older, did they retain Vietnamese?
That's a great question. For those who were in their, and I should say, if I could step back for a moment, I also, part of the history that I tell is about the migration of Amerasians. So those with kind of American fathers and Vietnamese mothers who came in the late 1980s, once they'd kind of grown up in Vietnamese society, and there was preferential legislation that the US passed to allow their migration. So that population definitely is, you know, speaking Vietnamese as their primary language. But you're right, for the adopted, even those who, you know, came over with some language at the age of 4, it's not reinforced, right? There's no Vietnamese language in the schools. There's not really Vietnamese in the community, so the language is largely lost. And I think that is regretted, right? Especially for those who want to discover more and go back to Vietnam, want to have a kind of fluidity in the culture and feel like they can. So yeah, I think very few kind of kept their Vietnamese. I mean, other parts of the culture, I think they can recover and are trying to do so. The language is hard. Some are learning the language, but it's a difficult language to learn from scratch.
Do you get the chance to present internationally at conferences around these topics?
Not yet. I would love to. You know, part of it is frankly the budget at a state university. That's the challenge, and now of course it's hard. Wondering getting back into the country. So I haven't, but that would be great just to see it in an international setting and hear those questions. And
if you get the grant to do that, along with knowing where to eat in LA, I want to hear how they receive what you have to say.
That sounds great. I love that idea.
All right, we're gonna have to wrap it up. So thank you all for being with us today.